I wanted to talk about cannabis today as well because I think it affects my therapeutic relationship with my clients. At this stage, a lot of them are smoking cannabis, or some of them will be smoking cannabis, but they don't feel they can talk to me about it because of legal issues. They think they're going to get in trouble. They think that if they tell us, we're going to call the police, that they'll lose their home. So this is kind of, for me as a nurse, it's a massive block between me and the people who I'm trying to have a therapeutic relationship and hopefully a client-centred approach get better and well. I just wanted to raise a point that was a chicken and egg debate, that people, some people more susceptible to psychosis. Is are they more likely to do drugs? Is it a genetic kind of link? There's a big debate of do drugs cause mental illness or do people who are mentally unwell use drugs? What is the opening kind of start to that? Like what causes what happens first? G'day. I want to bring your attention to the fact that there's a health and legal issue here. Like in other countries such as Portugal, they've used depenalisation as a way of bringing drug matters more into the health sector. All evidence is showing that drug use is down and that clinicians working in these areas feel that they're much more easily to engage with people who are supporting on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. I think Gavin's going to talk more about depenalisation, but generally that's a reduction in severity of control that reduces the severity of a sentence in this instance if people are using cannabis. I want to raise a point that I think with 52% of New Zealanders, so evidence has shown, having smoked or actively using cannabis, it's a human rights issue. And if people can smoke tobacco or they can drink alcohol, which in itself causes far more issues than cannabis ever has done, but the drinks lobbies will tell you differently. Right. There's the abstinence versus harm and harm minimisation approach. I appreciate some people should never smoke cannabis or should stop immediately. It is not the drug for them. But through my own practice as a nurse, I believe that my knowledge around harm minimisation, allowing people to be given all the facts as they are and allowing them to make an adult choice for themselves is by far a far better way of getting people to responsibly use drugs such as cannabis. Yeah. I think that the media has an important role to play in improving how New Zealand looks about drugs. And I think an example being the recent K2 media front page shenanigans with day after day, like naming dairies, which lo and behold, everybody then goes to buy the substance, which I thought was really clever. You know, it's almost like somebody working in the RDT may have shares in Matt Bowden's larger psychedelic company. Yeah, who knows? But yeah. It's the fact that negative campaigns have never worked. I can remember from my own readings, even as a young nurse, the Heroin Screws You Up campaign in the UK at the time increased to a triple-fold in the number of people who were using heroin within a number of weeks. You know, so that's something worth remembering. I'm going to show you a video in a minute, but I want to say that there's lots of evidence that cannabis has been proven to be good for mental health issues and general health issues as well. For several years we've had Sativex coming through GW Pharmaceuticals, the cannabis spray. Unfortunately it costs as much as an ounce of cannabis at $300 plus. So yeah, I think people may be just using other therapies for that, other than the spray. And just bringing to your attention on the video I've got today, it's going to look at cannabinoids, or CBD as we'll call it, on THC, and showing that like a lot of cannabises these days are very heavily laden in THC, and the amount of CBD which is present in them is very minimal. It's found actually that CBDs are very good for psychosis and for anxieties in some people. Not all, but it is a treatment which is possible to do. Yeah, so finally it might be worth saying that synthetic substances such as K2 are only THC synthesised, but contain no CBDs, and therefore I think it's a travesty that these substances are being allowed to be smoked within New Zealand, even though they have far more negative effects. I personally would think that it's because the government can own a recipe of artificial THC, whereas it grows freely in the garden in its natural form. It looks like a big cash-making venture. Well, that's just my thoughts. I'm going to quickly show you the video that I brought.
Is it really true that the skunk out there can play havoc with your mind? Here at the Institute of Psychiatry, I've agreed to take part in a unique medical trial designed to find out. It's part of their ongoing research into the link between strong cannabis and psychosis. The scientists are interested in the effects of the ratio between the two main components of cannabis, THC and cannabinoid. So on one day, I'm being injected with pure THC, something like ultra-high potency skunk. On the other day, I get a mixture of THC and cannabinoid, more like the natural makeup of the cannabis plant. When I get the injections, I don't know what I'm getting. It turns out that this one is a mixture of THC and cannabinoid. After 10 minutes, it hits me. With the THC and cannabinoid, no matter how hard I try to take the experiment seriously, it all seems hilarious.
What does it feel like? It looks very enjoyable.
My God, it's fun! It's amazing. Amazing. With the pure THC, it's a different story. It's horrible. It's like being at a funeral. It's sort of like, it's just so depressing. You don't want to dope yourself. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of morbid. After 15 minutes, I begin a series of psychological tests designed to measure whether I've become psychotic, and if so, how severely. I feel agitated. No. On the THC and cannabinoid mixture, I seem really flippant. On this drug, I just don't care. I'm experiencing profound insights. Bollocks. And what I say to my way to end, I don't want it to end. This experience is frightening. Strong. I feel agitated. Yeah, I do. But with the pure THC, I'm suspicious, introverted and weird. Every question seems to have a double meaning. The trouble is, my attention's like really, must be into just a word or something. It's like, but not in a happy, it's like in a morbid. That's how I feel. Morbid. It's anxiety. It's like a panic attack. Do you know what I mean? It's like you ask me a question, I'm thinking, I don't know the answer. I'm just one of many volunteers taking part in this trial. The doctors are hoping to answer some of the really important questions about cannabis and psychosis. For example, do people react differently to exactly the same dose of THC? And can cannabinoid reduce the psychotic effect of THC? It certainly made me uncontrollably giggly. 2 hours later, the effects have worn off. So just how psychotic did I get? The psychiatrists use a standard test which measures changes in psychotic symptoms.
On the first day you scored 1. Your change from baseline to the peak experience was 1, which is insignificant. Above 4 is thought to be clinically significant. Above 4 would be what you might expect in schizophrenic psychosis. And you scored 14 on the second day, so you were really quite persecuted and really it felt quite unpleasant.
I scored 14. An increase of 14 points on pure THC was very high and suggests that the new breeds of skunk can play havoc with your mind. But with no history of mental illness and no predisposition to schizophrenia, I was at no long-term risk.
Hello. That was a funny video. I haven't seen that one myself. So my name is Abe Gray. I am a spokesperson for NORML. I'm affiliated with the Otago University 420 protests, and I'm also involved with the Legalized Cannabis Party. And you may have seen me on the Star yesterday. We're opening up a new cannabis legalization activism center in South Dunedin. But Matthew asked me to come and talk a little bit about the civil liberties and human rights aspect of cannabis and making the case for legalization. So normally I'm interacting with people who are supportive of cannabis law reform, but I do like to come to talk to groups that are sort of adversarial towards the idea. And looking at the group here, I think a lot of you probably would be supportive, but let me just give you some basic information. You know, cannabis is a drug, that's what we hear, but actually cannabis is a plant. That's the name of the genus. The species is Cannabis sativa, and it's been cultivated for over 12,000 years. So one of the earliest agricultural crops known to man. In the scientific anthropological literature, there's about 5 historical agricultural crops that we argue about which one was the very first. And we don't have really the archaeological technology to go that far back in history and establish a finite date for each one, but we know that cannabis was one of the first. And as a part of that, it formed the foundation for early global commerce, okay? So agriculture was what allowed humans to develop civilization in the first place because of those products coming from agriculture. And cannabis sativa, also known as hemp, as an agricultural product, has lots of industrial uses, sails and rope for ships, fabric for clothing, paper for when we invented written language, and the ability to store grain for long periods of time to build up surplus nutrition and protein and keep that safe to feed large generations, feed sort of extended family groups, allow us to concentrate into cities and things like that. So it's been a nutritious food, it's been an effective medicine for 12,000 years, and it's only been prohibited for 100 of those years. So it's a blip on the radar, the current prohibition that we're experiencing. Here at Otago University, we have a lot of cannabis smoking that takes place in the form of the Monday, Wednesday, Friday 420 public smoke-in sessions in their 10th year now. So for the past 10 years, Otago students have met on the campus without missing a single week. So that's over 500 weeks. Smoking cannabis in public, putting themselves in harm's way as an act of protest to say, we're sick of it, we're fed up with this unjust law, overturn prohibition now. Government reports have said it should be changed, the Law Commission has said it would be changed. Anybody who accepts evidence or worries about best practice thinks we should reform cannabis laws. Now, a lot of people get upset with us about that. They say we're tarnishing the university's reputation, we're ruining the image of Dunedin. Well, I hate to break it to them, but the Education Act of 1989, Section 162, Part 4A, Subsection 5, I've had to quote this many times, stipulates that universities act as the critic and conscience of society. And the only way they can do that is to allow their students free and unfettered political speech. So there's a lot of conscience issues in the past that have been solved partially thanks to university students protesting. Back in the 60s at this university, we had mixed platting. They used to not let males and females live together. Now it seems like a no-brainer. Obviously, we were really stupid to try to forcefully repress those students 50 years ago. Then in the 70s, we had Vietnam. Oh, yep, we realized that was wrong now too. The Springbok Tour, also wrong. Fees, students got bashed in the 90s. We realized that we've driven up billions of dollars worth of debt and we're putting them on a never-ending cycle of poverty, just like they do in the United States. So these were all conscience issues, and the students who were thought to be so naughty at the time, really speaking out forcefully against this, have now been vindicated by history. They got appointed as professors. We're very happy that they did what they did. These are conscience issues. Anyone here have a conscience? Because cannabis law reform is a classic conscience issue, just like these ones I mentioned before. And you know, we're a little bit on the cutting edge, but history will vindicate us as well. So once we've solved this problem and everyone's decided, oh yeah, it was wrong to throw those people in jail or, you know, hit Granny with a billy club because she chooses a certain type of medicine, then maybe I'll get an apology from the university. I'm not going to hold my breath. So there's several reasons why cannabis should be legal. The most obvious one is for sick people, the medical reason, okay? So there's real conditions like multiple sclerosis, wasting, related to chemotherapy or AIDS treatment that can be dealt with very effectively by cannabis medicines. Now, in the crudest form, that's just smoking cannabis, because that's the cheapest, easiest way to get to it. But now we're learning more and more about how the cannabis plant works, and we heard about cannabinoids in that video we just watched. And they weren't using the scientific terminology correctly, but hey, it's the BBC. Cannabis has over 60 different cannabinoids in it. The substance they were talking about calling cannabinoid is actually called cannabidiol, and both cannabidiol and THC are types of cannabinoid. So there's a lot of different cannabinoids that do a lot of different things, and we don't really know scientifically what all of those do yet, and we can't research it very easily because there's all these restrictions because of the legal status. Now that's changing in some overseas jurisdictions, and we're seeing an explosion in the body of literature and the evidence that there is for cannabis as an effective medicine. That has nothing to do with me. I'm a healthy young adult. I have no health issues, but I smoke cannabis every day just as a personal choice. I like it to relax. That's sort of how I wind down after hard days of work. Helps me de-stress, as it were. So for those of us who are using it for recreational purposes, it's really a civil liberties issue, an issue of hypocrisy and justice, and I'll get to that in a moment, because there's all these other harmful practices that we have in our society that we didn't decide that militarized police enforcement is sort of the way to minimize the harm, which is supposedly what our official drug policy is. Additionally, there's people in prison, okay? So we want to keep Kiwis out of prison. It costs a huge amount to put them there, and it takes them away from being able to contribute to society. Now, murderers, rapists, we all agree that there's a need for prisons. Cannabis users, nonviolent offenders, is not one of them. So people have their whole careers and families ruined because of this legal issue. And I haven't even started to talk about the potential economic development we're holding ourselves back from here in Dunedin. Now, you may have seen the Star yesterday. We're opening a legalized cannabis museum in South Dunedin. We're going to employ people there. We're starting cannabis tourism ventures to showcase the cannabis culture that Dunedin has to offer in a strictly legal manner, just showing what's there. We have a huge cricket test with a bunch of Jamaican cricket fans coming here in December. So there's plenty of demand, plenty of opportunity to grow tourism. Unshackling the hemp industry could allow greater nutrition. It's currently illegal to eat hemp seeds, and it would remove onerous restrictions on farmers. We excel at primary produce, so this is a potential export industry. And my colleague, Julian Crawford, in the audience here, pictured with me on the Star yesterday, he's currently running for Dunedin City Council and Otago, or Southern District Health Board, Otago constituency, and we plan to unveil a comprehensive recovery package during the course of this campaign to revitalize Invermay as a center of excellence for the hemp industry, researching hemp as a food and fiber, but also as a medicine, because hemp contains all 59 cannabinoids except THC. So just quickly, cannabis is not as harmful as it's made out to be. The chemicals in cannabis have never killed anyone. This data is a bit old, and I will update it eventually, but when you look at tobacco or alcohol or even opiates, that's in descending order of the amount of deaths caused. Cannabis is zero, okay? So we allow tobacco, we allow alcohol. Cannabis is what's known in the medical literature as non-toxic. It has a low LD50. I'll wrap it up. Other more greatly toxic plants are not prohibited, like datura. Alcohol is obviously not prohibited. So the reason that they still use to justify prohibiting cannabis then is not the actual deaths or sort of health maladies, but what they call social harm. Now the police came up with the drug harm index, which I call the cost of prohibition index, because they say it costs $431 million per year in social costs for cannabis. Well, when you look at where that's spent, 50 million on police and customs, 70 million on corrections, 250 million on the courts, plus the NZDF, who refuses to release figures for how much it costs to fly the Air Force choppers all around and rip out crops, plus what they call lost output. That's when people get fired from their job because of drug testing. Okay, so all of these social harmful costs are actually coming from enforcing prohibition, not from the physiological effects of the drug itself. So alcohol costs hundreds of millions, 4.4 billion a year. We still have Hyde Street. Rugby, 64 million a year in ACC, 100 million a year in gambling harm blood money from pokies, surge in violence when the All Blacks lose. David Nutt, the scientific advisor to the UK government, got fired for pointing out how ecstasy is safer than horse riding. I'm pointing out that cannabis is safer than rugby. Okay, so 81% of New Zealanders have tried alcohol. They use it every year. Everyone in New Zealand has tried rugby or forced to at school. And 80% of us have used cannabis, 80% youth, 50% have tried it, okay? So we're not gonna kick down doors to look for booze bottles or rugby balls. Why do we do it for a bag of weed, okay? There's all these other environmental reasons. I won't take any further time.
My name is Gavin Cape. I'm not here to counter what Abe was saying, but something I want you to, or needs to be considered if there was law reform. And this is really about, from my perspective, being an addiction medicine specialist, about the adverse health effects. One of the things that I think about is, I think this whole debate really is a conflict between ethical values. And it's how much individuals have their personal freedom, which is not at the expense of others, versus people who feel that the law is set in stone, the legal moralist. One of the things which is very difficult when you're looking at health is if you have something which is deemed illegal, then it's extremely hard to know what is going on behind closed doors. So, research on cannabis and its use, there's a paucity around the world, and it's very difficult to know what goes on, even though Geoff will give us some insights in his very good study that he's done locally. This debate, in a sense, is about what are the costs of prohibition versus the costs of liberalising the laws. But I'm going to concentrate a little bit on health harms as we know it. I guess people who smoke cannabis, they have a range or a diverse range of effects. Matthew pointed out that some people find the intoxicating effects of alcohol as aversive. And there's no doubt that it has a physiological effect on the body, can alter the mood, and for some people can induce a sense of paranoia. And I guess if people don't like that, generally they don't keep doing it, although there are some silly people out there. Another aspect I think which would need to be addressed would be impairment with regard to driving motor vehicles. I think this is a very hard one for reformists and people who think about reforming the law, which I'd have to say I'm in favour of, as in reforming the law. But driving whilst impaired, there is a small but significant increase in the possibility of motor vehicle accidents, and both mortality and morbidity. Working at the Community Alcohol and Drug Service, we do see quite a lot of people who consider themselves addicted to cannabis and find it difficult to come off. As a basis for life, really, if you do something too much, it's likely to cause harm for the individual. And you could say that about many activities, including rugby and sports and even study and all sorts of things. You can say that about cannabis. There are some people, it seems, who do develop a very strong attachment to cannabis, which has an exclusion kind of effect on their lives, as in that they would rather smoke cannabis than do other things they previously enjoyed. That's just a fact of life, and that's the same as many activities in our lives. There is some evidence that there is some respiratory and cardiovascular impairment. You could say that if anyone smoked a particulate matter, then they're going to get some impairment in their lung function. Professor Robin Taylor, who's now left here, was a respiratory physician. He famously said if you smoke chrysanthemums, which have no psychoactive effect, but because it's particulate matter, it will affect your lungs. There also is some effect on cardiovascular system, both in the acute phase, in that you do, for naive smokers of cannabis, you quite reliably get an increase in about 20 beats per minute of your heart rate, which for some people who have a heart condition could be dangerous. Long-term cardiovascular impairment is much more difficult to delineate. The more harder aspects of health harms would be, for example, attainment and educational level. I think there is, overall, probably increasing evidence that use of cannabis during adolescence is not a good idea at all. I have to say there is conflicting evidence about this too, as there has been some very large cohort studies, particularly in the UK, looking at 14-year-olds who smoke cannabis on a regular basis. And that particular research, following these people up, showed actually no difference in educational attainment. However, one would have to say, if you go to school and you're intoxicated, the very effect of cannabis and impairment of cognition, you're not going to take the work in. So it does depend on the context of use, most importantly. One of the hardest things to look at is the relationship of cannabis use and mental health. When people talk about cannabis causing psychosis or causing schizophrenia, it is very difficult to interpret the evidence, and there is conflicting evidence all round. I think one can almost safely say that cannabis use, possibly if heavy, may cause an increase in psychotic disorders. The difficulty is that people would smoke cannabis to change their mental state anyway. That is part and parcel of smoking cannabis. And the research, when they look at psychotic episodes, you could also, if you look at it very carefully, you could also say those psychotic episodes are not true psychosis as we think of long-term impairment, but are the acute effects of the cannabis itself, as it does alter your perceptions. It's part and parcel of the reason for smoking cannabis in the first place. The what's it called now? This is the David Nutt, the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs, which is an independent research body. They estimate that if you were to prevent one episode of schizophrenia, we would need to stop 5,000 men and 7,000 women aged 20 to 25 from ever using cannabis, which if you look at it in public health model, that's just impossible to do. There is also conflicting evidence in the sense that there's been a 20-fold increase in the use of cannabis in the UK over the last 40 years. There has been a steady decline in the incidence of psychosis and schizophrenia over the last 20 years, despite skunk coming along, which has got much higher levels of delta-9 THC. So that goes against the causation effect of cannabis causing schizophrenia. I think in mental health circles it's well known that if you do have a mental health condition, particularly of schizophrenia and the psychotic kind, it's probably a good idea not to smoke cannabis. However, there's been some evidence that, particularly the use of cannabidiol, which is the good part of, if you like, of cannabinoids, that it does alleviate some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. Even though the people often who have schizophrenia and are smoking cannabis know that it also makes some symptoms worse. So it's very difficult to tease out the pros and cons of all this. I'm not going to say much more because I think Geoff will have. This is just a very brief summary. I'm not going to talk about it at the moment, but the costs of prohibition versus the benefits of prohibition. I think overall the prohibition has not deterred use, and I think that's evident in Portugal and other countries like Holland who have a more liberal attitude towards cannabis smoking. With this, I'll hand over to Geoff.
Kia ora tātou. My name is Geoff Noller. I'm an anthropologist with an interest in drug taking as a cultural practice. And just the slide there shows, I'm going to have just a wee sort of, I guess, broad brush stroke talk about cannabis as a medicine. Fortunately, or not, as may be, a fair bit of that seems to have been covered already. Thank you, guys. But I just want to pick up on, first of all, just a general idea of cannabis as a medicine. And obviously, this can both be whole cannabis, which the New Zealand Law Commission referred to as raw cannabis, or it can be components of cannabis, such as THC or CBD cannabidiol, which is we've already discussed in the video at the beginning, was referred to as cannabinoids, but they meant CBD. And as Abe has already mentioned, also there's a long history of the use of cannabis as a medicine, and so this is not something that's suddenly, developed in California in 1973 or something. It's got quite a long history. There is a degree of complexity associated with cannabis as a medicine. As Abe has discussed, and he's far more qualified to do so, being a botanist, there are, he referred to cannabis sativa as the only plant. There's that big discussion about the species variations, isn't there? We won't get into that, but there's sort of two strains, cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, and as you can see by that slide there, each of these has a predominance of perhaps one of the cannabinoids over the other. And as both of the other guys who've spoken already, and as Gav just mentioned, there's a difference between the effects for people between THC, and again, just referring back to the video that we saw, when that person when she was injected with the THC, she became very, very anxious, paranoid, concerned, and her rating in terms of her psychosis when it was evaluated was quite high relative to her experience when she was injected with the CBD dominant cannabis, and so these are factors that are thought about when we think about what are the possibilities for using cannabis as a medicine, and certainly there seem to be some advantages, as Gav suggested, in looking at varieties of cannabis that might have what he referred to as the good part of the cannabis plant. So they're just, there's two different varieties. Now these are pure strains, and they're sort of they might be almost an idealised version. These days there's a lot of crossbreeding of plants for a range of reasons. Some of them medicinal and some of them recreational, with people using recreationally wanting certain experiences, and people who have more preference or desire or interest in using the plant medicinally to experience something that specifically engages with their issues. I think also one of the big points that seems to come up is that there is this tension in terms of how people view the validity or viability of cannabis as a medicine. I'm sticking with North America here. It just as an example, as we'll see in a minute, there is a strong emphasis on the use of cannabis medicinally in America, and so we'll just consider some of the options here. So you have the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and who are basically saying, well, look, you know, when you think about the negative consequences, many of which Gavin outlined, it seems inappropriate to have to consider cannabis as a medicine. On the other hand, the US Institute of Medicine report a range of conditions which benefit from the use of medicinal cannabis. And I think, to be realistic, there is increasing evidence. It makes it quite clear that cannabis does have medicinal properties. There's not a lot of debate about that. Exactly what those properties are, how it's going to be developed is another matter, but there is very clear evidence of medicinal value for cannabis. And there's a list of countries there where cannabis is currently legal. I think the most recent one is North Korea, so you may not be able to get food there, but at least you can get medical cannabis. Just got a map here of, this is valid to, I think, June this year, and it just gives an example of the places where cannabis is, medical cannabis is legal or available. So this isn't recreational use, this is purely medicinal use, with the dark blue there representing very clear access, light blue showing decriminalisation for medicinal cannabis, not for recreational cannabis, and on the other end of the scale, the red indicating where medicinal cannabis is completely prohibited, and that, as you can see, also includes New Zealand. Okay, so there's quite a shifting, there's been a shift in opinion, I think, recently with regard to this. This is just one example. This guy here, Sanjay Gupta, who recently produced a video called Weed. As you can see, he was this CNN sort of chief medical correspondent. So if something happened that CNN wanted to talk about in terms of medicine, they'd get hold of Sanjay and he'd talk about that. And he had been holding forth for quite a period of time about the negative consequences of cannabis and undermining, well, not undermining, but critiquing the idea of it as a medicine, and spent a year or so doing a video or creating a documentary where he went all around the world and started talking to people about medicinal cannabis, and suddenly started thinking, well, gee, this is actually really quite different from what I thought. And as a consequence, he ended up changing his mind, and it's actually quite an interesting video, and you can, as that reference there shows, you can check that out online if you're interested, and it's really quite an interesting documentary to look at. Well, what about Cannabis in Aotearoa? I don't know whether there's a clash of the codes here, with the emphasis on the dangers of rugby, and whether you combine that with cannabis, whether that makes it even worse, I don't know. But certainly we use a lot of cannabis in this country. We have a very high level of use per capita relative to the rest of the world. In fact, probably in developed nations where we're up there with Canada, which is first, so we're probably first or second. Here's some stats from the Ministry of Health, 2008. You can see very high levels of use here amongst these groups. 25 to 34 age group, over 60% of males reporting use. That's lifetime prevalence. Perhaps more relevant is 12-month prevalence. But again, so this is people who've used in the last 12 months, and so again you can see, you're looking around 30% for some of these groups of people. So we use a lot of cannabis in general, recreationally, as a consequence of which I think it's reasonable to say that if you were thinking of using cannabis medicinally, there's probably plenty of opportunity in New Zealand to do that. I did a PhD a few years ago in looking at cannabis use, and I interviewed a group of current users in Dunedin, and around about 75% of them, when we came down to it, looked at some kind of medicinal use. And it was interesting that Abe mentioned like de-stressing at the end of the day, and I think you can sort of broadly think that might also be something that you could put in that medical category in a way. There's also then the issue around how do you use cannabis. Okay, raw cannabis can be smoked, it can also be vaporized, which is vaporizing the active ingredients without combusting the plant material itself, which gets around concerns about the lung function. And then we have Sativex, which Abe also mentioned, or it might have been Gav, Sativex. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, and this is a product, this is effectively just a whole cannabis extract. And it balances THC and CBD, and it's used primarily for multiple sclerosis in New Zealand, but it does cost around $300 for a small bottle. And I think, as Abe pointed out, you can buy an ounce of cannabis for the same amount. So whether or not there's an advantage to use Sativex is another matter. The Law Commission, however, in 2011 did say that they felt that under the circumstances that raw cannabis should be made available for medicinal purposes. If we think about New Zealand, of course there are barriers to this. Cannabis is completely illegal in this country. As the paraphernalia, such as vaporizers, you can't buy them. They can be imported, but you can't buy them. And if you're caught with them, then you face a prosecution for their possession. And not only that, but if you process cannabis, thereby avoiding it being smoked, you turn it into an oil, or you turn it into a tincture, or a food, you cook it and make it into butter, then cook stuff with it, you're actually converting it to a Class B drug from a Class C drug, so you're actually exposing yourself to greater harm in context of the legal consequences of using. I'm currently trying to explore the possibility of putting a study together, and in New Zealand, under the Misuse of Drugs Act, physicians are allowed actually to prescribe whatever they want, well, relative to the need of their patients, and also to the whether they are prepared to support that. We had received some funding for this, so that's a really good start, and had in fact partnered up with a cannabis medicinal cannabis advocacy group who had in fact a number of patients on their books, and they had quite a good set of criteria that allowed them to say, right, we'll work with you guys as medicinal patients. Now, they weren't providing cannabis, but they linked between people who produced cannabis, illegally of course, but facilitated that linkage with these patients. The patients themselves had the support of their medical practitioners, and that was one of the criteria for being involved in this advocacy group and being seen as medical patients. So there were quite good protocols around recruiting these people as patients, and that was all looking pretty good. Then what happened was the source of the cannabis was busted, and so suddenly that stops. The patients are left in a situation where, well, what do? We don't have cannabis. If we want cannabis, we've got to go out and get it. And the whole project is kind of, I wouldn't say it's stalled, but it's suddenly become a lot more difficult. So one of the consequences of the current regime around cannabis in general, and the negative approach to medicinal cannabis in New Zealand, is that if you wanted to do research, if you wanted to find out whether this in fact does work, whether is it efficacious for these people, this becomes quite difficult, and this is an example of that situation. Okay, so just to sum up, clearly there is evidence of efficacy of medicinal cannabis. There are grounds for being concerned about its use, or the use of whole cannabis. Concerns relating to lung function, and I think mental health issues, and those I think have been drawn out by the other speakers as well. And there's also the notion of the indeterminate dose of cannabis. How much cannabis is a person getting if they cook cannabis up? Do we know what they're getting, and what is the quality of it? I think that realistically, a lot of those concerns can be gotten around, and they can in fact be a bit of a smokescreen, in my view anyway, for other views or other reasons why people would want to maintain the current legislation as it is. And I think we're looking at their moral views, and not particularly views that are supported by solid evidence. I've already mentioned the Law Commission's 2011 review. They made it very clear they felt that raw cannabis or whole cannabis should be accepted. But having said that, because of the current laws, people who are wanting to use medicinal cannabis, or maybe they're exposing themselves, if they're not making the choice of not using medicinal cannabis, and they're having to use other medicines that may be less effective, or medications that are more expensive. They're risking legal penalties if they get caught using medicinal cannabis, because the police aren't going to cut them any slack. If I'm using it medicinally, well, sorry, you can't do that. And it was a case, I think, in Tasman, in the Nelson region, a year or so back, where a woman in her 60s was growing cannabis for her husband to relieve his pain, and she was busted. He lost his medicine, and she went to court, and in the end she was actually discharged without conviction. But of course she'd had to go through that whole process. It was really quite stressful, I'm sure, for her, and so on. So these are some of the negative consequences. And also, of course, people who are using illegal cannabis medicinally are exposing themselves to risks in the marketplace. So there are some reasons why maybe we might want to think about looking at the laws, at least in the context of medicinal cannabis. All right, thank you.
I suppose this is a moment when we ask if there's any questions or somebody wants to raise any points.
Yeah. How do you tell whether you have a predisposition for psychosis and should avoid cannabis altogether?
Very good question, very difficult to know in practice. There is thought to be, you can do a genetic test on a rather vague enzyme which is thought to be deficient in some people. It's difficult to know the clinical significance of this, but the Dunedin multidisciplinary study have thought that there is a relationship between some people who are homozygous for a certain gene which might predispose people. Its clinical significance is unknown, but if you have a strong family history, especially an immediate family, would have to say need to be very cautious about exposing yourself to cannabis. That's my view.
And whenever you try cannabis for the first time, or any drug for the first time, it's probably advisable to take a small dose and, monitor your reaction and sort of self-titrate. If you have an adverse reaction, cut it off.
So follow on from your answer, if you have a bad reaction to cannabis, are you likely to always have a bad reaction, or is it something that varies within person for your response to it, like LSD, for example?
In my personal experience, it definitely depends on the set and setting, like the context you're taking it in, obviously the person, and then we just heard about the wide variation in amount of cannabinoids and ratios of different cannabinoids one to the other in different strains. So I would say no, but if you do have that adverse reaction and you have a family history, probably steer clear.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I'd say as well that there's a link between psychosis and childhood trauma or things that have happened in your life. So if you feel that those things have happened in your life, you may already have a link there or be more likely to suffer from psychosis later on. So if there's evidence and information out there to guide people that it may not be the drug for them, or if you insist on using it, because some people also have a gene which makes them more likely to dabble with drugs. So if you've got the psychosis gene and you've got the dabbling with drugs gene, that may be less useful. But again, on a harm minimisation approach, if you give people information and they know to use small amounts if they want to use, rather than throwing themselves wholeheartedly into it, then I see that's a better option. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, it was very informative. I just wanted to know, where's the government currently at with reforming cannabis law?
The government's sort of been in a bit of a holding pattern since the Law Commission's review came out in 2011. I've actually just come back from a couple of days in Wellington with the New Zealand Drug Foundation, and about 100 people from about 67 organisations were invited up to put together a response to the lack of movement around the Law Commission's report, amongst other things in relation to drugs. Of course, you've also had all the business with the synthetic cannabinoids recently, which is quite an innovative piece of legislation, but it does make people then say, right, well, where does cannabis sit with that? One of the problems we've got with government is that politicians are hugely aware of their exposure to being aligned with something which has become so polarised. Basically either you're for against drugs or you're against drugs. Even if you talk about the idea, well, maybe we should look at reform, you're suddenly immediately pro-drugs, and so it's very difficult for it to be politically survivable for people to make any change in the political realm. And I think I don't know whether Gav got into this. You were talking about the possibility, I think, of what sort of changes they're likely to be in the future. I feel somewhat pessimistic myself that there will be much change, because it's a very, very difficult thing for politicians to engage with. Again, like next week I'm going to a health select committee to do an oral submission for a petition for medicinal cannabis, which is being heard at the moment. And they'll go to that committee, and there's a bunch of people talking there, including the Ministry of Health. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic at present in terms of how things will change. Although having said that, we are seeing a lot of movement globally. You're looking at 2 states in America, which has always been the heartland of the drug war, have legalised cannabis recently, Colorado and Washington State. So that's kind of crazy. I think there's 18 states, that are there's medicinal cannabis in the States, 18 of them.
I just wanted to do a little shameless plug. What Geoff said is totally correct about politicians feeling that this issue is not politically survivable. And there's a big stigma, like Geoff said, over this polarized issue, where if you even talk about it, you're seen as with the hippies, with the legalizers. So we've started a new campaign called Let's Start the Conversation, using sort of corporate charity branding and nice design to encourage people to break the taboo, to remove that stigma and create a safe space that's not affiliated with definite cannabis law reform or definite maintaining prohibition, just having a conversation so people can say what they really think. And we strongly believe that if people say what they really think, then it will be clear that there is consensus for reform, and if the politicians can see that, then they'll move. Unfortunately, we just have to kind of trick everyone into saying what they think. So if you go to conversation.org.nz, if you feel like this is an important issue, please visit conversation.org.nz and interact or send us an email, and maybe we can get something happening. And with medical cannabis, in the courts, no legitimate doctor-approved medical cannabis user who has challenged their prosecution has had a strong sanction in the last 12 months. So through the courts, we may see some precedents set very soon that medical is okay.
Hey guys, we've run out of question times. The next people want to come in. I don't want to be impolite. If anybody wants to carry on any debate, we could do it out there, maybe, in one moment. Yeah, I'm just aware we've only got it till now. We've already gone over. Look, thank you for coming today. I appreciate you taking the time.